Welcome. Take a breath. If you're listening right now, there's a good chance someone crossed a line today. A comment that lingered longer than it should have. A tone that stayed with you on the drive home. You didn't explode. You didn't say what you wanted to say. But somehow, it followed you anyway. There's a moment like that many men know well. Late evening. The house is quieter. The phone is face down. And you realize something uncomfortable. It wasn't what they said that disturbed you. It was how much space it took inside you. Most people think respect is something you demand, or defend, or win back with the right words. But there's a point in life when that idea stops working. When reacting only makes things heavier. When staying silent feels wrong, and speaking up feels just as empty. What if respect was never about them at all? What if it was shaped in a quieter place long before the moment of conflict? Tonight, we're going to look at that place, not with anger, not with excuses, but with clarity. Let's begin there. What if that place we're about to look at is the reason it keeps staying with you? Because the strange thing about disrespect isn't the moment it happens. It's how it follows you long after it's over. You're done with the conversation. You nodded. You walked away. You even told yourself it's not worth it. And yet, later that night, it shows up again, in the quiet, while brushing your teeth, while staring at the ceiling. The words replay slightly sharper each time, not loud, persistent. It's rarely the insult itself that hurts the most. It's the feeling that something crossed into your space without permission and stayed. Most people think disrespect lingers because it was too harsh or too unfair, but that's not the real reason. If it were every rude comment would ruin your day, they don't. Some roll right off, others sink in. The difference isn't what was said, it's what you did with it. Picture this. You're driving home after work. Traffic is slow. The radio is low. And suddenly the scene replays. Not because you want it to, but because your mind hasn't closed the door yet. Part of you is still standing there, still waiting to respond, still wondering if you should have said something different. That unfinished moment keeps the loop alive. The Stoics noticed this long before psychology gave it a name. They understood that events don't cling to us on their own. We carry them. Not deliberately, almost politely. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we are disturbed not by things but by our judgments about them. That line sounds simple, almost too simple, but it points to something uncomfortable. When disrespect stays with you, it's often because a question went unanswered inside. Did that mean something about me? Did I just allow that? Did I lose ground? Until that question settles, the mind keeps circling. Here's where most people go wrong. They think the solution is a better response next time, a sharper line, a stronger tone, something that proves they weren't weak. But that only trains the mind to stay on alert, to scan for threats, to relive moments that are already gone. The Stoic approach is quieter and harder. It asks you to notice this. The moment you took their words home with you, you turned a brief encounter into a long one. You gave it space, time, energy, not because you're fragile, but because you care about your standing in the world, about being seen clearly, about not being diminished. That instinct isn't wrong. It just needs direction. Disrespect loses its grip when you stop treating it as unfinished business. When you decide deliberately that the moment is over, even if it didn't resolve the way your ego wanted. This is where control actually begins. Not at the mouth, but at the boundary between the event and your inner life. The Stoics didn't aim to become numb. They aimed to become selective. Selective about what earns a second thought. Selective about what gets to echo in the quiet. Once you see that something shifts, you realize the problem was never the other person's behavior. It was the open door you didn't know you could close. And learning how to close it calmly, cleanly, is where everything starts to change. Learning how to close that door changes something else too. It exposes a habit most people never question. Politeness, not kindness, not respect. Politeness. It shows up quietly. In the meeting where someone talks over you and you smile anyway. In the family gathering where a joke cuts a little too close and you let it pass. In the checkout line, the gym, the group chat, where you swallow the irritation because you don't want to make things awkward. On the surface, it looks mature, civil, controlled. Inside, something tightens. You tell yourself, it's the right thing to do. That being polite keeps the peace. That reacting would make you that guy. But later, when you're alone, there's a different feeling. Not anger exactly, more like a quiet self-betrayal. You replay the moment and notice what bothered you wasn't their behavior, it was yours. There's a version of politeness that slowly teaches you to step aside from yourself, to smooth things over at your own expense, to trade honesty for approval. In American culture, this gets praised early. Be agreeable. Don't rock the boat. Keep things friendly. But adulthood asks a harder question. Friendly to whom? And at what cost? The Stoics made a sharp distinction here. They valued calm, restraint, and courtesy, but never at the price of self-respect. Epictetus warned that when you try too hard to avoid discomfort, you end up living by other people's terms, not because they're powerful, but because you handed them the steering wheel. Politeness becomes dangerous when it replaces clarity, when it keeps you from naming what's happening, when it trains you to endure small violations without acknowledging them. That's how dignity erodes, not in dramatic moments, but in a series of tiny concessions no one else notices. You feel it when you laugh at something that didn't feel funny, when you nod instead of speaking, when you go along just to keep the temperature down. Over time, the body remembers. The shoulders slump a little. The voice gets quieter. You hesitate more than you used to. This isn't about becoming rude, or confrontational, or hard. It's about understanding that politeness is a tool, not a virtue. And tools have limits. Marcus Aurelius wrote about living in accordance with your nature. For a rational adult, that means responding truthfully to what's in front of you. Not theatrically, not aggressively, but honestly. When politeness silences your honest reaction. It stops being virtue and starts becoming avoidance. Here's the deeper Stoic insight most people miss. Dignity doesn't come from how others treat you. It comes from how faithfully you treat your own judgment. Each time you ignore that inner signal, you weaken trust with yourself. Each time you acknowledge it, even quietly, you strengthen it. You don't need to correct every comment. You don't need to explain yourself to everyone. But you do need to stop pretending nothing happened when something clearly did. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't perform. It stands still long enough to recognize the truth of the moment. Politeness has its place. So does silence. But dignity begins the moment you stop confusing comfort with character. And learning where that line is, that's the work. That line you're learning to feel, that quiet boundary between comfort and character, isn't new. It's old. Older than office politics. Older than social media. Older than the idea that your value rises and falls with how others treat you. The Stoics lived in a world that didn't reward sensitivity. Public insults were common. Power was uneven. Reputation could turn on a sentence spoken in the wrong place. And yet they weren't obsessed with defending themselves. They understood something we've slowly forgotten. They knew that the most important part of any encounter happens before a word leaves your mouth. Picture a man walking through a crowded forum. Noise everywhere. Arguments breaking out. Someone points. Someone laughs. He keeps walking. Not because he didn't notice, because he had already decided what mattered. The Stoics separated life into two categories: what you can govern and what you can't. You don't control someone's tone. You don't control their manners. You don't control whether they respect you. But you do control what you give weight to, what you let shape your mood, what you carry forward into the next hour of your life. That distinction wasn't philosophical trivia to them. It was survival. Marcus Aurelius wrote these notes to himself late at night, after long days of command and pressure. Not to sound wise, to stay sane. He reminded himself that another person's behavior cannot stain your character unless you invite it in. Not unless you decide it means something about who you are. This is where modern thinking gets tangled. We treat disrespect as a verdict, as evidence, as something that demands a response to restore balance. The Stoics treated it as information, nothing more. Information about the other person's state, their habits, their lack of discipline. And here's the deeper part most people skip. Stoicism isn't about enduring everything in silence. It's about choosing where to place your force. If someone is rude, the question isn't, how do I shut this down? It's, is this worth my inner movement? That shift changes everything. Instead of bracing for impact, you observe. Instead of reacting, you assess. Instead of proving, you decide. Epictetus taught that when someone insults you, they're offering you a role in a play. Anger, defensiveness, humiliation. You're free to decline the part. That freedom is subtle. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. No one applauds it. But it preserves something essential. When you stop chasing respect outwardly, you begin to cultivate it inwardly. You become less available for chaos, less reactive to noise, more grounded in your own measure of yourself. This is why Stoics placed such emphasis on judgment. Not opinions. Judgment. What you decide something is. If you judge disrespect as a threat, your body prepares for war. If you judge it as irrelevant, it fades. Not because you're indifferent to life, but because you're loyal to what deserves your attention. The Stoics didn't forget that people can be cruel. They simply refused to let cruelty set the agenda. They trained themselves to stand in the middle of pressure without being shaped by it, to move through crowded, careless worlds without losing their center. That understanding hasn't aged. We just stopped practicing it. And remembering it slowly, deliberately, is the beginning of a different kind of strength. That different kind of strength shows up in a very specific place. Not in theory, not in reflection, but in the moment something rubs against you the wrong way. A meeting table, a family dinner, a comment tossed out with just enough edge to test you. That's where the Stoics were always looking. They didn't ask how to avoid conflict. They asked what conflict reveals, because every moment like that follows the same quiet pattern. First, there's conflict, something external, a tone, a dismissal, a look that says more than words. It's brief, often small, but it lands. Then comes choice. Not the dramatic kind, the subtle one. Do you tighten your jaw? Do you fire back? Do you laugh it off and shrink a little inside? Do you say nothing and let resentment build? Most people never notice this part. They think reaction is automatic, instinctive, out of their hands. The Stoics knew better. They understood that between what happens and what you do, there's a narrow space. So narrow, you can miss it if you're not trained to feel it. But it's there. And inside that space, something is being shaped. Character. Not reputation, not image. Character. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind you live with long after the room empties. Think about how many times you've replayed a moment, not because of what someone else did, but because of how you responded, or didn't. That's character speaking back to you. Marcus Aurelius treated each irritation as a rehearsal, a chance to practice being the kind of person he respected when no one was watching. Not perfect, not passive, deliberate. He wrote about waking up each day, expecting difficult people, not with bitterness, with preparation. Because when you expect resistance, you stop being surprised by it. And when you stop being surprised, you stop being owned by it. Conflict to a Stoic isn't a signal to attack or retreat. It's a signal to choose. Choose what kind of man you are becoming in small moments. Choose whether this instance deserves to leave a mark. Choose whether you act from impulse or from principle. This isn't about winning exchanges. It's about not losing yourself in them. Picture a simple scene. Someone cuts you off mid-sentence. Not aggressively, casually. You feel it immediately. The heat, the tightening, that's conflict. Now the choice appears. You could interrupt back. You could stay silent and disappear. Or you could pause, meet the moment honestly, and respond in a way that aligns with who you are. not who they provoked. That response might be a calm sentence, or silence that doesn't collapse inward, or simply continuing when space opens again. From the outside, it might not look like much. Inside, it's everything. Because each time you act from choice instead of reflex, you reinforce a pattern. And patterns become habits. And habits become character. The Stoics believed your life isn't defined by major decisions alone. It's defined by what you repeatedly choose under pressure. That's why they didn't obsess over controlling others. They focused on training themselves. Conflict will keep coming. Different faces, same test. You don't need to eliminate it. You need to meet it consciously. When you do something settles, you stop feeling pushed around by moments. You start standing in them. Conflict arrives. Choice opens. Character forms. That's the loop. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that loop, something becomes clear. If conflict is inevitable and choice is where character is formed, then the smallest moment matters most. That moment is the pause. It's so brief, you almost don't believe it exists. A breath, a beat, a fraction of a second where your body wants to move faster than your mind. Someone says something sharp. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough. Your chest tightens, your jaw sets, words line up ready. That's the edge. Most lives are shaped right there, not by what happens, but by how fast we let ourselves react. The pause doesn't look impressive. No one notices it. There's no applause. But it's where your life quietly comes back under your control. Think about how many hours you've lost replaying conversations. How many nights were spent refining a response that never got said? How much energy went into moments that were already over? All of that starts with speed. The Stoics understood this at a practical level. They weren't trying to suppress emotion. They were trying to slow the hand before it slammed the table. Seneca warned that anger is never stronger than in its first flash. Catch it early, he said, and it weakens. Miss it, and it takes the wheel. The pause is how you catch it. Not by forcing calm, by buying time. Picture a simple scene. A coworker makes a remark that cuts. The room stays quiet for a second longer than usual. That second is the pause. You don't rush to fill it. You don't explain. You don't smile to smooth it over. You let the moment stand. Inside, something shifts. Your breath deepens without effort. The urgency loosens its grip. Now you're choosing instead of reacting. This is where modern advice often goes wrong. It tells you to stay calm, as if calm were a switch you flip. The Stoics knew better. They built systems that worked under pressure. The pause is a system. It interrupts the reflex loop. It reminds the body that it's not under attack. It gives the mind a chance to step back and ask one question. Is this worth my next move? Most of the time, the answer surprises you. Not because the other person suddenly seems right, but because you see how small the moment actually is. The pause shrinks the problem before it enters your life. It also does something deeper. Each time you pause, you prove to yourself that you are not owned by impulse, that you don't have to perform on demand. that your dignity isn't fragile, that trust builds quietly. You start to notice fewer emotional hangovers, less replay, less tension carried home. Not because people stop being difficult, but because you stopped letting difficulty dictate your rhythm. This isn't hesitation, it's discipline. Athletes know this. So do first responders. The ones who last learned how to slow down when pressure spikes. The Stoics were training for the same thing. A life where your inner state isn't constantly hijacked by external noise. The pause gives you space. Space gives you choice. Choice gives you yourself back. You don't need to change your personality. You don't need to become cold. You only need to stop being rushed. That single breath taken at the right moment does more than diffuse a situation. It preserves your time, your energy, your clarity, and over time, that's how a life becomes lighter. When you slow things down like that, another option becomes visible. One most people misunderstand: silence. Not the kind that comes from fear, not the kind that collapses inward, but the kind that's chosen. There's a moment after the pause when words are available. You could speak, you could explain, you could defend yourself, and sometimes you don't. You let the air stay still. In American culture, silence often gets misread. It's seen as weakness, as hesitation, as losing ground, so people rush to fill it. They talk to prove they belong. They argue to prove they matter. They explain to prove they're not guilty of whatever just got implied. But chosen silence does something different. It changes the shape of the room. Think about a meeting where someone throws out a cutting remark. Not a direct insult, just enough to test you. Everyone waits for your response. You don't rush. You don't smile. You don't counter. You look up. You stay present. And you say nothing. The silence stretches just a little longer than expected. That's not weakness. That's control. Inside there's movement. You feel the urge to clarify, to clean it up, to rescue the moment. But you don't follow it. Epictetus warned that people can only provoke you if you agree to play the part they assign you. Angry man, defensive man, ashamed man. Silence is how you refuse the role. This isn't about winning a standoff. It's about refusing to feed a dynamic that drains you. Most disrespect thrives on reaction. It needs friction. It needs proof that it landed. When you respond immediately, you give it oxygen. When you respond emotionally, you give it authority. Chosen silence starves it, not dramatically, cleanly. There's a difference between being unheard and being unhooked. Unheard silence feels heavy. It's full of swallowed words and regret. Unhooked silence feels light. It's deliberate, grounded. You know why you're quiet. You're not freezing. You're observing. You're letting the moment show itself without interference. Often, the other person reveals more than they intended. They fill the space. They soften, or they double down and expose their own lack of control. Either way, clarity increases. The Stoics valued this kind of silence because it protected something essential: inner alignment. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you don't need to make every opinion known. You don't need to react to every impression. You only need to remain faithful to your own reasoning. Silence, when chosen, keeps your center intact. It also sends a quiet message to yourself. I don't need to explain my worth. I don't need to perform calmness. I don't need to correct everything. That message accumulates. Over time, you notice a shift. Fewer words feel urgent. Fewer situations feel personal. Not because you care less, but because you're more selective. This doesn't mean silence is always the answer. There are moments that call for clear boundaries, for firm words, for direct action. But silence earns its place when speaking would only tangle you further in something small. It's not avoidance, it's restraint. And restraint, practiced consistently, becomes strength. When silence is chosen, it doesn't shrink you. It sharpens you. You remain present, unmoved, and quietly in command of yourself. That's not weakness. That's discipline in its most subtle form. Once you understand silence, another truth comes into focus. Silence protects your center. Boundaries protect your life. A boundary isn't a speech. It isn't an argument. It's a line. Most people imagine boundaries as something loud, confrontational, awkward. In reality, the strongest boundaries are almost quiet. They show up in small moments, a steady voice, a sentence that doesn't explain itself, an action that follows through. Think of a situation many people recognize. A coworker keeps interrupting you, not aggressively, just enough to establish a pattern. At first, you let it go. Then again, then again. Each time you tell yourself it's not worth it. You don't want to be difficult. You don't want to seem sensitive. But something else happens. The pattern hardens. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It tests. It watches what you tolerate. The Stoics understood this with clarity. They didn't believe in controlling others. They believed in governing access. Epictetus taught that if you don't decide what is acceptable, someone else will decide for you. Not out of malice, out of habit. A boundary is how you interrupt that habit, not with anger, with calm certainty. There's a moment when silence alone is no longer enough. When staying quiet starts to feel like disappearing. That's the signal. A boundary doesn't need many words. Sometimes it's as simple as, "I'm not okay with being spoken to that way." And then you stop. No lecture, no justification, no emotional charge. In American culture, this kind of directness often feels uncomfortable at first. We're taught to soften, to cushion, to make sure everyone feels okay. But boundaries aren't about comfort. They're about clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you should not be afraid to state plainly what is necessary, not to dominate, but to live in accordance with reason. A clear boundary does two things at once. It respects you, and it gives the other person a chance to correct course. What happens next tells you everything. Some people adjust immediately. They didn't realize the line was there. Others push back. They question your tone. They accuse you of overreacting. That reaction isn't a problem. It's information. It shows you who benefited from the lack of a boundary. Here's where many people falter. They set a boundary, then retreat. They explain. They apologize for needing it. That weakens the line. A boundary only works when it's paired with action. If the behavior continues, the conversation ends. If the pattern repeats, access changes. Not as punishment, as consequence. The Stoics didn't see this as harsh. They saw it as just. Justice to them wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about maintaining order internally and externally. When you allow repeated disrespect, you teach others how to treat you. But more importantly, you teach yourself what you're willing to accept. Boundaries restore that balance. They don't make you rigid. They make you predictable in the best way. People learn that you're calm, clear, and not available for games. Over time, something shifts. Conversations change. Dynamics settle. Not because you became intimidating, but because you became consistent. A boundary isn't a wall, it's a gate. It decides what enters and what doesn't. And once you start setting them without guilt, without drama, without apology, life simplifies. You spend less time explaining, less time recovering, less time replaying. You stand where you are, and others meet you there or they don't. Either way, your dignity stays intact. That line drawn calmly and held steadily is the one that changes everything. Once you can draw that line and hold it, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't suddenly become polite. People don't stop testing you. In fact, the tests often increase. A comment here, a challenge there. Someone pushing just a little harder than before. At first that feels unfair, like progress should have earned you peace. But the Stoics saw it differently. They asked a question that changes the entire experience. What if this isn't a setback? What if it's training? Consider how strength is built anywhere else. In the gym, resistance doesn't mean failure. It means the weight is doing its job. No one expects muscles to grow without tension. Yet emotionally, we expect life to go easy once we get better. The Stoics didn't make that mistake. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle in your path is not something to be removed, but something to be used. Not because suffering is noble, but because character is shaped under pressure, not comfort. Think about the moments that actually test you, not the big speeches, not the clear-cut victories, the small frictions. The coworker who ignores your boundary once to see if you meant it. The family member who slips in a familiar jab. The stranger who assumes you'll shrink like before. Each one is a quiet exam. You feel it immediately. That internal surge. The old impulse to react, defend, or shut down. Here's where the training begins. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What is this asking of me?" Patience, restraint, clarity. The Stoics believed every encounter had a lesson built in, not because the other person was wise, but because you were practicing becoming so. Epictetus compared difficult people to sparring partners. You don't hate the bag for hitting back. You don't resent the weights for being heavy. You use them. This doesn't mean tolerating abuse. Training isn't submission. It's engagement with intention. If someone crosses a line, the training might be to reinforce the boundary calmly. If someone provokes, the training might be to hold silence without collapsing inward. If someone disrespects you publicly, The training might be to leave with your dignity intact instead of chasing validation. Each response strengthens a different muscle. The mind learns it doesn't need to flare up to stay whole. The body learns it doesn't need to brace for every threat. Your sense of self learns it can remain steady even when the environment isn't. Over time, the shift is noticeable. Moments that once hijacked your day start to pass through faster. The replay shortens. The emotional residue fades. Not because you became indifferent, but because you became practiced. This is the part most people never reach. They want relief without repetition, peace without discipline. The Stoics accepted repetition as the price of mastery. They didn't ask for easier lives. They trained for stronger responses. And here's the quiet reward. When you start seeing disrespect as training, it loses its sting. It no longer feels personal. It feels functional. Another rep, another chance to reinforce who you are when no one is applauding. You stop dreading these moments. You meet them with a steady curiosity. Can I stay grounded here? Can I respond cleanly? Can I walk away without carrying this home? Each yes builds confidence that doesn't depend on praise. You begin to trust yourself under pressure. That trust is rare. And once it's there, it changes how you move through the world. Disrespect still shows up. It always will. But now it serves a different purpose. It trains you, and you're no longer surprised by the weight. Once you start treating these moments as training, another shift becomes possible. You begin to step back, not physically, mentally. It's subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. A comment lands. You feel the familiar spark, and then distance. Not detachment. Perspective. Most disrespect feels overwhelming because it's viewed up close, right at eye level, right inside the moment. From there, everything looks bigger than it is. The tone feels sharper, the implication heavier, the threat more personal. The Stoics trained themselves to change the vantage point. Marcus Aurelius practiced an exercise he called seeing from above. He would imagine himself rising out of the situation, out of the room, above the city, until the people involved became small figures moving through their own limited concerns. Not to feel superior, to feel accurate. When you step back like that, patterns appear. You notice how often disrespect comes from restlessness, from insecurity, from people carrying pressures they don't know how to hold. You see how little of it is actually about you. Picture a moment that once would have stuck with you for days. A dismissive remark, a sarcastic tone, a glance meant to diminish. Now, imagine looking at it a few hours later from a distance. After dinner, after a walk, after sleep. It already feels smaller. The Stoics learned to create that distance immediately, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by placing it in context. They asked questions like, will this matter tomorrow? Will this shape my character? Does this interfere with my ability to act justly or clearly. If the answer was no, the event lost its grip. This isn't avoidance, it's scale. Modern life encourages the opposite. Everything feels urgent. Every slight demands attention. Every comment feels like a referendum on your worth. The Stoic response is quieter. It says not everything deserves the same weight. When you step back, you begin to see how often disrespect is noise, static in a crowded signal. You also notice something else. When you don't immediately engage, situations often resolve themselves. People clarify, they move on, or they reveal exactly who they are without you lifting a finger. That information is useful. From a distance, you can choose your response instead of being pulled into theirs. This perspective doesn't make you passive, it makes you selective. You stop asking, "How do I win this moment?" and start asking, "Is this moment worth winning at all?" The Stoics believed your attention was your most valuable resource. Once spent, it's gone. They guarded it carefully. Stepping back protects that resource. It allows you to reserve your energy for things that matter. Your work, your relationships, your health, your principles. Over time, this changes how you experience the world. Disrespect still happens, but it rarely settles. It arrives. You notice it, you assess it, and you let it pass. Like traffic noise outside a window you've learned not to open. This isn't coldness, it's maturity. You're not above others. You're simply no longer inside every passing storm. When you step back, most disrespect shrinks to its true size. Small, temporary, often irrelevant. And in that space, something steadier takes its place. Clarity, the kind that allows you to move forward without dragging yesterday's weight behind you. That clarity is quiet, but it's powerful. And once you know how to access it, you don't rush back to the old view. When clarity settles in like that, something surprising happens. The need to respond begins to fade, not because you've given up, but because you've moved on. There comes a point where you realize the strongest response to disrespect isn't silence. It isn't boundaries. It isn't even perspective. It's direction. You stop asking how to handle them and start asking where your life is headed. That shift is quiet, but it changes everything. Think about the people who once bothered you the most, the ones whose words lingered, whose opinions felt heavy. Notice where they are now in your mind, smaller, fainter, almost irrelevant. Not because they apologized, not because you won an argument, but because your life grew. The Stoics believed this was the final move. Not confrontation, not withdrawal, flourishing. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is to be unlike the one who harmed you, not in bitterness, in quality. When your days are full of purpose, disrespect loses leverage. It has nothing to grab onto. Picture a life with momentum, work that demands your focus, relationships built on mutual regard, habits that strengthen your body and steady your mind. In that life, a careless remark barely registers, not because you're numb, but because you're occupied with something better. This is where many people misunderstand Stoicism. They think it's about enduring life, white-knuckling through it. It's not. It's about building a life so aligned that distractions don't derail you. Living well doesn't mean living loudly. It means living deliberately. You show up on time. You keep your word. You take care of what's yours. You walk away from what isn't. Over time, this creates a quiet gravity. People sense it. They adjust around it, or they drift out of range. Either way, the noise drops. Disrespect thrives on attention, on reaction, on the sense that it matters. When you stop feeding it, it starves. This doesn't happen overnight. It's cumulative. Each time you choose your work over a pointless exchange, each time you invest energy where it compounds, each time you let someone's behavior remain their problem, you're not avoiding conflict. You're prioritizing life. The Stoics called this inner freedom, not needing external validation to stay whole. When you live this way, something settles deep inside. You trust yourself to handle whatever comes without losing your direction. That trust is powerful. It means you don't scan rooms for approval. You don't brace for disrespect. You don't rehearse conversations that may never happen. You're busy living. And from that place, disrespect becomes what it always was: a minor event, a passing signal, a test you've already outgrown. The goal was never to control how others see you. It was to become someone whose life doesn't pause for small minds. Live well, quietly, consistently. And one day, you'll notice something simple. They stopped mattering. Not because you hardened, but because you grew. And from that place of growth, one truth remains steady. Your respect comes first, not the respect you demand, not the respect you chase, the respect you practice when no one is watching. It shows up in the way you pause before reacting, in the way you choose silence without shrinking, in the way you draw a line and hold it without anger, in the way you step back, see clearly, and move forward anyway. None of this was about controlling other people. It was never about winning conversations or proving strength. It was about preserving something quieter: your judgment, your direction, your peace. The Stoics believed that a person's real measure is revealed under pressure, not when life is easy, but when something unfair brushes up against them and they still act with restraint. They didn't promise a world without disrespect. They offered a way to meet it without losing yourself. When you respect your own reasoning, you stop outsourcing your worth. You stop waiting for permission to feel steady. You stop giving strangers and passing moments the power to define your mood. That's freedom. It doesn't make you distant. It makes you grounded. You still care. You still engage. You still stand up when it matters. But you do it on your terms. The world will always test you, at work, at home, in public places where patience wears thin. Those tests don't end. What changes is who you are when they arrive. You become slower to flare, quicker to see, less willing to carry what isn't yours. That's not indifference. It's discipline. And discipline, practiced daily, becomes character. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that no one can harm you without your cooperation. Not because people aren't capable of harm, but because your inner life is yours to govern. When you protect that inner space, everything else finds its proper size. Arguments lose urgency. Insults lose weight. Disrespect loses its claim on your attention. What remains is direction. You invest your energy where it builds. You show up for what matters. You let the rest pass. This is how respect is earned internally, first outwardly, second. And it doesn't require perfection, only awareness, only practice. So, as you move back into your day, carry one thing with you. The next moment of friction is not a threat. It's an invitation to pause, to choose, to reinforce the kind of person you're becoming. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to explain it. Just live it. Your respect comes first. And when that becomes your standard, the world adjusts or it fades into the background. Either way, you remain standing, calm, clear, and quietly in control of your life.